Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive here on the show. We get a lot of requests, and a lot of you have been asking us to cover the really, really dark side of history, and I think today's topic definitely fits the bill. We're diving into the life and crimes of Hamilton Howard Albert Fish.
Cobra Fish.
Yeah, he went by Albert, so. Active in the early 20th century, Fish is really, I think, a figure that evokes a strong reaction. And we're going to try to unpack this carefully, going through the details of his case. Our main source today is the Wikipedia article on Albert Fish. It's a pretty extensive article, and it really goes into a disturbing amount of detail about his life.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, that's for sure.
And so our mission is to kind of extract the most, I guess you could say, salient and unsettling aspects of this story. We really want to try to understand, the historical context, the just sheer horror of his actions, but, always trying to keep our approach objective and informative.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult area to explore, but it's also an important one. And as we kind of go through these specifics, it's really crucial to remember that there's a profound human tragedy at the heart of this case. And our goal is to understand, not to sensationalize.
Absolutely. To kind of set the stage for just how dark we're about to go, just consider some of the aliases that Fish adopted. The Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac.
Oh yeah, those are all pretty creepy.
And the one that I think really gets under your skin, the Boogeyman.
Oh yeah, that one's definitely the worst.
So his confirmed murders actually took place between July 1924 and June 1928, but he confessed to 3 that the police could actually verify, and he also admitted to stabbing at least 2 others. And, he even went so far as to boast that he had children in every state,
Right.
claimed around 100 victims in total. Now, it's never really been clear whether that number referred to just rapes or cannibalization.
Right, because there's no way to actually prove that, is there?
No, there's really no way.
And who knows if he was even being truthful? It's so hard to tell with someone like this.
Right, absolutely. But ultimately, he was apprehended on December 13th, 1934. He was executed on January 16th, 1936 for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd, which we will definitely get to in a bit.
Yeah, these initial details, right away, it's pretty disturbing stuff, right? The number of aliases alone,
Yeah.
it suggests that he was really trying to, create this terrifying persona for himself.
Right, and then the claims about the victims, even if we can't be sure they're true, it just points to this really dark and unsettling kind of self-aggrandizement that he had.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start to unpack kind of how such a person, how such a monster comes to be. Let's look at his early life. Hamilton Howard Fish was born on May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C. His parents, Randall Fish and Ellen Frances Howell, had a significant age difference.
Really?
His father was actually 75 when Albert was born.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah, he was a full 43 years older than his mother. And he actually preferred to be called Albert after a deceased sibling, which is kind of interesting.
It makes you wonder if that early, desire to identify as someone else might be kind of a hint at maybe a fragmented sense of self.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about for sure. And when you start to dig into his family history, this really disturbing pattern starts to emerge. You see, the sources all indicate that there was, a lot of mental illness within his family.
Oh, really?
His uncle, he had mania. His brother was institutionalized in a state mental hospital.
That's pretty serious.
A paternal half-brother suffered from schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
His sister Annie is described as having a mental affliction.
So there's definitely a history there.
Even his mother, she reportedly experienced hallucinations.
Yeah.
So, it really does make you consider the interplay between those genetic predispositions, the environmental factors in his development.
Absolutely. It's definitely not a simple answer, but there's definitely something going on there.
Yeah. And his early life takes a really tragic turn when his father died in 1875. And after that, his mother had to place him in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. And while he was there, he was subjected to pretty frequent physical abuse.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, and this is where things start to get even darker. You see, Fish reportedly began to not just endure, but to actually enjoy the physical pain that was inflicted upon him.
Wow. That is really troubling.
Yeah.
To develop masochistic tendencies that young, particularly as a response to trauma,
Yeah.
it really suggests that there's a fundamental disruption in how he understands pain and pleasure.
Right.
And that's going to have some pretty significant implications down the line.
Oh, absolutely. By the age of 12, his behavior had escalated even more. He started a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to some really repellent practices. I mean, we're talking about drinking urine, eating feces. Yeah. He also started frequenting public baths to watch other boys. And, later he started sending obscene letters to women he found through classified ads.
So even early on, you can see this pattern of increasingly, aberrant sexual interest.
Yeah.
And there's a deeply concerning lack of boundaries, like social boundaries, there as well. And, you combine that early exposure to such extreme acts with his enjoyment of pain, and it's like it's a recipe for a trajectory of escalating perversion and a growing detachment from societal norms.
And that's exactly what we see. So moving into his early adulthood, by 1890, so he's 20 years old at this point,
Oh,
he moved to New York City. And there he actually engaged in male prostitution and began to molest and rape young boys, most of whom were under the age of 6.
this is really heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
To go from those secretive, deviant behaviors to these overt criminal acts.
Yeah.
It's a clear progression, and a very disturbing one at that.
Right. In 1898, his mother actually arranged a marriage for him to a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman.
Okay.
And they had 6 children together.
Wow. So he's got this family life going on at the same time that he's engaging in these horrific acts.
Right. And it really underscores how someone with these deeply troubling urges can just present this facade of normalcy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, you would never know, looking at him, what he was capable of.
Absolutely not. So in 1903, his criminal activities finally catch up with him. He's arrested, convicted, and incarcerated at Sing Sing prison for grand larceny.
Okay.
While he was incarcerated, he later recounted a formative experience. He said that a male lover took him to a wax museum where he became fixated on a really detailed bisection of a human penis.
Ugh. That's just awful.
And he claimed that this experience really ignited an obsession with sexual mutilation.
So this is like a turning point for him in a really, really bad way.
Yeah, several years later, around 1910, he's working in Wilmington, Delaware, and he meets a 19-year-old man named Thomas Bedin.
Okay.
And their relationship, it developed into sadomasochism, although it's really not clear how much Bedin was actually consenting to this, because Fish's own confessions suggest that Bedin was intellectually disabled.
Right.
And, Fish, he subjects Bedin to 2 weeks of torture. He ends up tying him up and cutting off half of his penis.
Oh my God, that's just horrific. It's a huge escalation in his sadism, when you say.
Oh, absolutely. Before it was just assault, but now he's moved on to this deliberate infliction of just severe physical harm.
Yeah.
And the way that he remembers it, the fact that he remembers it in detail, including Bedin's reaction, it suggests that this is a memory that stayed with him.
And maybe even a memory that he enjoyed.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, but it definitely points to a deep psychological shift that had happened.
Definitely.
So in January 1917, his wife leaves him. She leaves him for another man. She takes most of their possessions, and this leaves Fish to care for their children alone.
6 kids on his own.
6 kids on his own.
Wow.
And he told a newspaper later on that this really deeply affected him, this event.
That's understandable, I guess, on some level, even though,
Right.
everything else that he's doing.
But around this time, he starts to experience these auditory hallucinations, and he starts engaging in some really extreme acts of self-harm.
Oh, wow.
X-rays later on actually revealed that there were at least 29 needles embedded in his groin and abdomen.
He did that to himself.
He did that to himself.
Wow.
He used a nail-studded paddle to beat himself, and he inserted burning materials into his anus.
I don't even know what to say to that. That's just awful.
It's really disturbing.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to note that he did not physically abuse his own children.
That's something, at least.
However, he did encourage them and their friends to paddle his buttocks with the same nail-studded device.
Yep. So he still these kids into this really messed up world, even if it's not, direct physical abuse.
Right. It really speaks to just a complete breakdown in his understanding of, appropriate behavior, boundaries.
And the impact of his actions on others.
Right. So we're moving now into the period between 1919 and 1930. And this is where his criminal behavior takes an even more An even more sinister turn.
It can get worse.
It can get worse. Around 1919, he confessed to stabbing an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown.
Oh, God.
He later admitted that he specifically targeted individuals who were mentally disabled or African American because he had this horrific belief that they wouldn't be missed.
That's just so cold, so calculated.
It's really chilling. And he referred to his weapons as his implements of hell.
What were his weapons?
It was a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw.
Those are some pretty gruesome tools.
Absolutely. So in July 1924, he actually attempted to abduct an 8-year-old girl named Beatrice Keel. This was from her parents' farm on Staten Island. But thankfully, her mother intervened and prevented the abduction.
So there were some close calls.
Oh, yeah. But later that year, Fish is 54 years old at this point, and he's experiencing psychosis. He becomes convinced that God is commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children.
Wow. So he's not just a monster. He's a monster who thinks he's doing God's work.
Right. It's just this complete delusion that he's somehow, carrying out these divine orders.
And that level of delusion, it's terrifying.
So shortly before he abducted Grace Budd, he actually tested out his implements of hell on a 10-year-old boy named Cyril Quinn.
All right.
This is a boy that he had been molesting. And Quinn and a friend actually discovered Fish's weapons hidden under his mattress, and thankfully they managed to escape.
That's lucky for them.
So incredibly lucky. And despite this really disturbing private life that he's leading, he briefly married Estella Wilcox in 1930.
He got married again.
Yeah, but it only lasted a week. And in 1930 and 1931, he was arrested for sending obscene letters.
Again?
Again.
This guy never learns.
No, it doesn't seem like it. And he actually underwent psychiatric evaluation at Bellevue Hospital.
So they knew something was wrong with him.
Yeah, but obviously not enough to stop him.
It's just amazing that he kept getting away with this for so long.
It's really chilling.
Makes you wonder, like, how many other victims there might have been that we just don't know about.
Right. So now we come to the truly horrific murder of Grace Budd.
Okay.
On May 25, 1928, Fish responded to a classified ad in the New York World. It was placed by Edward Budd. He was an 18-year-old looking for a country work position.
Okay.
3 days later, Fish, using the alias Frank Howard, visited the Budd family in Manhattan.
Oh.
And he later confessed that his initial intention was to harm Edward.
So he went there with the intention of hurting this young man.
Yeah, but then upon meeting Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace, his focus shifted. He made up a story about needing a flower girl for his niece's birthday party and managed to convince Grace's parents to allow her to go with him that evening.
That's awful. I mean, the way he was able to manipulate these parents to exploit their trust.
And, they were desperate for work. I mean, times were tough.
And he just preyed on that desperation.
It's just heartbreaking. So he takes young Grace to an isolated abandoned house in East Irvington, New York. It was known as Wisteria Cottage.
Okay.
And he had scouted this location beforehand.
So he planned this out.
Yeah. And there, he strangled her to death.
Oh, God.
And what happens next is truly horrific. He decapitated and dismembered her body and then proceeded to cannibalize her remains over 9 days.
9 days.
9 days.
Oh,
So initially, the police investigation focused on a 66-year-old superintendent named Charles Edward Pope. He was actually arrested, but he was later acquitted.
So they had the wrong guy for a while.
Yeah, but then in November 1934, a full 6 years after Grace's disappearance, an anonymous letter arrived at her mother's home.
Okay.
Now, her mother couldn't read, so she had her son read the contents aloud to her.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
It was this rambling, deeply disturbing confession.
A confession.
It included these graphic descriptions of supposed cannibalistic practices in China. It detailed his meeting with the Budd family, his decision to consume Grace.
Oh, my God.
The abduction under the guise of the birthday party, the murder in the abandoned house, the dismemberment of her body and the consumption of her remains.
He just laid it all out there in this letter.
And he even described roasting her little ass.
I don't even know what to say to that. It's beyond comprehension.
Yeah, and in a really perverse detail, he claimed in the letter that he didn't sexually assault her.
Oh, the cannibals was okay. I mean, what kind of twisted logic is that?
Right. It just shows this complete lack of empathy.
And this bizarre attempt to distinguish between, different types of horrific acts, like one is somehow worse than the other in his mind.
Yeah. So the police investigated this letter. Of course, they couldn't verify his claims about cannibalism in China.
Right.
But the details that he provided about the kidnapping, those matched up with the limited information the authorities had.
So that must have given them chills,
Yeah.
right? To realize that this letter, even the unbelievable parts, might actually be true.
And it gave them a real lead in this cold case that had gone unsolved for years.
Okay, so how did they finally catch him?
Well, the envelope that the letter came in had this small emblem on it.
Okay.
And the investigators, they were able to trace that emblem back to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association.
Oh, wow.
And their investigation, it led them to a janitor who had taken some of the stationery from the association's building to his rooming house.
Yeah.
And then the landlady at that rooming house, she said that a man named Albert Fish had been living there recently.
So they're getting closer.
Yeah. So Detective William King, he's the lead investigator on the Bud case. He waits for Fish to come back to the rooming house. And when Fish shows up, he agrees to go with King to police headquarters for questioning. But then, all of a sudden, he pulls out a razor blade.
Oh, wow. So he almost got away.
King managed to disarm him and took him into custody. And Fish, he readily admitted to killing Grace. But initially, he claimed that he'd intended to kill Edward the brother, and that raping Grace never even entered his head.
But then he changed his story, right?
He did. Later on, he confessed to his attorney that he experienced involuntary ejaculations while he was strangling Grace. And this detail was later used by his defense team during the trial to argue that the murder was sexually motivated.
It seems like they were trying to make the cannibalism seem less important, like maybe hoping the jury would focus on the sexual aspect instead.
Right. And, that's still horrific, but...
Yeah, it's all horrific.
So after Fish was arrested, investigations started to uncover his involvement in these other horrific crimes. One of them was the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy, Francis McDonnell. This was on July 14th, 1924, in Port Richmond, Staten Island.
Okay.
And tragically, Francis's body was found later on hanging in a wooded area.
That's awful.
He had been sexually assaulted, he'd been strangled, and there were these extensive lacerations on his body, flesh even stripped from his hamstring.
Oh, God.
Yeah, and witnesses, they remembered seeing an elderly man with a gray mustache in the company of Francis. And this is where that moniker, the Gray Man, comes from.
Okay.
Fish denied any involvement in Francis's murder initially. However, in March of 1935, this is after he's already been convicted in the Grace Budd trial, and he's confessed to the murder of Billy Gaffney, which we'll get to.
Okay.
He finally admitted to raping and murdering Francis. He said that his intention was to castrate the boy, but that he ran away when he heard someone nearby.
So he had this specific plan in mind. He wasn't just acting randomly.
Right. It's chilling how methodical he was in his cruelty.
And the media, they really ran with this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he became this symbol of pure evil.
Absolutely. So another case that came to light was the disappearance of a 4-year-old boy, Billy Gaffney.
Okay.
This was on February 11th, 1927 in Brooklyn.
Okay.
And a really important witness came forward, a trolley motorman. He identified Fish as the man he'd seen with a distressed young boy, matching Billy's description on the day that he disappeared.
So there was at least one person who saw him with Billy.
Yeah, and another child who had been with Billy shortly before his disappearance referred to the man as the Bogeyman.
Oh, wow. So that nickname was really out there.
Right.
It wasn't just something he called himself.
Yeah, and investigators also learned that Fish had been working as a house painter in Brooklyn in February 1927, and he was working very close to where Billy was last seen.
So everything's starting to line up.
Yeah. Now, Fish initially refused to speak with Billy's mother.
Oh, I bet she was desperate for answers.
Absolutely. But he later provided a really detailed account of Billy's murder in a letter he wrote to his attorney.
Okay.
And in this confession, he describes taking Billy to a garbage dump near Riker Avenue, burning his clothes, whipping him, and then subjecting him to this horrific mutilation.
What did he do to him?
He cut off his ears, his nose, he slit his mouth, he gouged out his eyes.
Oh, God.
He drank his blood, dismembered his body, and then disposed of the body parts in slimy water near North Beach.
It's almost too much to bear. It's just pure evil.
And then he went on to describe, in detail, cooking and eating Billy's remains.
He ate him.
He did.
I don't know how anyone could do something like that. It's beyond human comprehension.
He even described roasting his, quote, sweet fat little behind, unquote.
Oh, my God.
And stewing other parts with specific ingredients.
I don't even know what to say to that. It's It's beyond monstrous.
It's beyond belief almost.
Yeah.
So Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 11th, 1935 in White Plains, New York.
Okay. And his defense team, they entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
Hmm.
And their argument was that he was driven by voices that he believed were from God commanding him to kill children. So they're saying he was insane.
Right. And numerous psychiatrists took the stand to testify about this long list of his sexual fetishes. I mean, we're talking about sadism, masochism, flagellation, exhibitionism, voyeurism, piquerism, cannibalism, coprophagia, urophilia, hematolania, pedophilia, necrophilia, and infigulation.
I mean, that's a lot, even for someone who studies this stuff.
That's an overwhelming amount.
And his defense attorney, I mean, he really emphasized this huge number of sexual abnormalities.
Right.
I guess hoping to convince the jury that he was just too far gone to be held responsible for his actions.
And a key witness for the defense was the psychiatrist, Dr. Frederick Wortham.
Okay.
And he testified about Fish's intense obsession with religion, particularly the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac.
Oh, interesting.
Wortham argued that Fish believed he was commanded to sacrifice a young boy as penance for his sins. And he theorized that Edward Budd, the brother of Grace Budd, was Fish's initial target, but that Grace ended up replacing him because of her size.
Because she was smaller and easier to overpower.
Right. And Wortham even suggested that Fish might have perceived her as a boy because of her size.
Oh, wow. So he might not have even known he was killing a girl.
And Wortham also drew this really disturbing connection between Fish's cannibalistic acts and the religious concept of communion.
So he's trying to find some kind of psychological explanation for this horrific behavior.
Right. And Wortham concluded his testimony with a very clear statement: he is insane.
So the defense has a pretty strong case, wouldn't you say?
But the prosecution, they fought back. They cross-examined Dr. Wortham. They asked him directly if Fish understood the difference between right and wrong.
Oh, that's a key question.
And while Wortham admitted that Fish had some level of cognitive awareness, he argued that his understanding was completely distorted by his religious beliefs.
So basically he's saying that Fish knew what he was doing, but he believed it was right because God told him to do it.
Exactly. Other psychiatrists that the defense called also supported Wortham's findings. They said that Fish suffered from a severe mental illness. But the prosecution, they brought in their own witnesses who argued that despite all of his obvious abnormalities, Fish was legally sane.
So it's a battle of the experts, basically.
Yeah, and one of the prosecution's psychiatrists, he actually said that Fish's perversions were, quote, socially perfectly all right, unquote.
Socially all right.
And that they were quite common, which is just shocking to hear now.
Yeah, especially considering the things he was doing.
Right. And another psychiatrist for the prosecution said that Fish's act of self-harm were motivated by sexual gratification rather than genuine masochism.
So they're trying to paint him as more of a calculated, cunning predator rather than someone who's genuinely mentally ill.
Right. And other witnesses for the prosecution, they tried to downplay the significance of his coprophilia and his apparent religious motivations for cannibalism.
So they're basically saying, yeah, he's weird, but he's not insane.
Right. And even Fish's 17-year-old stepdaughter testified.
His own stepdaughter?
Yeah, and she described these disturbing, inappropriate games that he played with her and her siblings.
So even within his own family, there were signs that something was deeply wrong.
Right. So despite reports that several members of the jury actually believed that Fish was insane, they ultimately returned a verdict of sane and guilty.
Wow. So even though they might have thought he was insane, they still found him guilty?
Right. And he was sentenced to death by electrocution.
And this was back in the 1930s, right?
Yeah.
So the death penalty was still pretty common.
Absolutely. And he was executed on January 16th, 1936 at Sing Sing Prison.
Okay.
And accounts say that he actually calmly helped the guards position the electrodes on his body.
That's chilling.
Yeah. His final words were, "I don't even know why I'm here."
I mean, how can you do all of those things and then say you don't know why you're there?
Right. And there were these rumors that circulated for years that the needles that he had embedded in his body actually short-circuited the electric chair.
Right.
But those were debunked later on. And then to add a final disturbing note to this whole thing, Fish's attorney, James Dempsey, he refused to reveal the contents of his client's final statement.
Oh, no.
He described it as the most vile and obscene string of words he'd ever heard.
Wow. So we'll never know what Fish's last thoughts were.
So we've reached the end of this very difficult deep dive. Let's just recap the key elements here. We've looked at Albert Fish's very troubled early life, the escalation of his horrific crimes over decades, the gruesome details of the Gracebud murder, and how that led to his capture.
And then, of course, the murders of Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney.
Right, and we talked about that controversial trial and his execution. As you've heard, the details of this case are just incredibly disturbing.
I think disturbing might be an understatement.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, this case really forces you to confront the darkest aspects of human nature.
Our aim throughout this whole discussion was to just present the information as it's documented in historical sources.
To just lay it all out there and let people draw their own conclusions.
Right, and to try to keep things objective without, sensationalizing or endorsing these horrific acts.
But it's hard, right? I mean, how can you not be horrified by this story?
Absolutely. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, you can check out that Wikipedia article we mentioned. It really gives a comprehensive overview of Albert Fish's life and crime.
And there are links to a lot of other sources and related topics.
Right. And if this deep dive has left you with any questions or you want to share your thoughts, we're always open to hearing from you.
Yeah, let us know what you think. This is a case that really stays with you.
It does.
It makes you wonder about, the limits of human cruelty and the nature of evil itself.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
See you next time.